It was a peaceful life on the ranch. My days were filled with the kind of solitude you only get when your nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away. The only interruption to the natural order of things was the heavy steel ranch gate at the end of my long gravel driveway. It wasn't just for aesthetics. It was a necessary part of keeping the property secure. That's why it was so infuriating when a pristine white SUV, completely oblivious to the no trespassing signs, pulled right up to the gate and parked, blocking me in. I couldn't believe the audacity. I had a feeling this was only the beginning. I'm writing this from my ranch in Texas, but I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Let me know in the comments. For a full minute, I just sat there, my truck idling, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. The white SUV was parked at a slight angle, nose in, leaving absolutely no room for me to pass. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon, and the driver was just sitting there, scrolling on her phone, completely oblivious to the fact that she was a roadblock on a private drive. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe she was looking for a lost pet? Or a dropped phone? But then she just sat there, head down, thumb swiping away on her screen as if she was in a Starbucks parking lot. I leaned on my horn, a quick, polite honk at first. Nothing. I tried again, a little longer this time. Still nothing. I laid on the horn for a solid 3 seconds, a long, angry blare that echoed across the pasture, that finally got her attention. She looked up from her phone, squinted at me through the glare on her windshield, and then, without a single gesture of apology or even a wave, she slowly pulled forward a few feet and drove off. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what she'd done. She just vanished down the road as if this was the most normal thing in the world. I pulled through the gate and locked it behind me, my mind racing. It was the arrogance that got me. The complete lack of consideration. This wasn't some lost tourist who made an honest mistake. This was someone who felt entitled to treat my private land like a public rest stop. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that this was the first car, but it wouldn't be the last. The peaceful quiet of my ranch had just been breached, and a new kind of problem had arrived at my front gate. The single car became a pattern. A week later, another one appeared. Then, another. They were never there for long, but they were always in the way, right in front of the gate, like it was their personal parking lot. It wasn't just the same white SUV. It was a rotating cast of characters, a dusty minivan with a soccer mom bumper sticker, a gleaming black pickup with oversized wheels, a compact sedan with an absurd amount of air fresheners dangling from the rearview mirror. They all had one thing in common. They treated the area directly in front of my locked ranch gate as a convenient and entirely legal place to idle. It was one thing to be blocked in when you're trying to leave. It was another thing entirely to be blocked out when you're coming home. I'd turn onto my road after a long trip to the feed store, my truck bed full of heavy supplies, only to find some stranger sitting there, chatting on their phone, completely unfazed by my presence. They'd look at me, give a half-hearted wave as if I was the one who was interrupting their day, and then slowly pull away once they were finished with whatever business they had. My peace and quiet were being chipped away, one 5-minute intrusion at a time. The no trespassing signs that were once a symbol of my privacy now felt like a joke. They were clearly being ignored, and every time I saw a new car appear, a little bit of my patience would drain away. I started to resent the gate itself, as if it was the reason they were congregating there in the first place. My ranch, my home, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a public parking zone. I was ready to do something about it. I just wasn't sure what. I finally found out who they were, friends of my new neighbor, a woman I've come to know only as HOA Karen. A woman whose whole personality seemed to be a series of passive-aggressive notes and attempts to enforce rules that didn't exist. She lived at the very end of the road, in a house so perfectly manicured and symmetrical it felt like a trap. I had seen her peering through her blinds more than once, watching the comings and goings of anyone who dared to drive down our dead-end road. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, and she saw the entire area, including my property line, as her personal domain. It turned out my ranch gate was her friend's designated meeting spot. They would pull up to my gate, park, and finish their conversations before heading up to her house. It was a bizarre and incredibly irritating ritual. My private property had become the official antechamber to her suburban kingdom. The convenience of not having to pull into her small, crowded driveway was apparently worth the inconvenience of blocking mine. I couldn't believe the level of entitlement. It wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a deliberate choice. I had a few small run-ins with her before this. She once asked if I was going to cut the grass that grew in my ditch, because she said it was unsightly. I had to explain to her that it was a natural part of living on a ranch, not a suburban lawn. Every time I saw her, it felt like she was sizing me up, waiting for me to do something that she could lecture me about. Now, the parking situation wasn't just a nuisance. It was a clear, direct challenge. It was her way of showing me that she and her friends didn't respect my boundaries. They were all on her team, and my ranch was just a piece of property in their way. I was ready to draw a line in the sand, and I knew I couldn't be polite about it anymore. My first response was the obvious one, a polite but firm note left on the windshield. It explained that this was a private drive and that parking there was a safety hazard. The car left, and the note was balled up and thrown on the ground. I had gone out to the barn that morning to grab some tools, and when I saw the minivan parked where it shouldn't be, I resisted the urge to storm up to the driver's side window. Instead, I grabbed a pen and a piece of paper. I took a few deep breaths and wrote out the message, trying to make it sound as reasonable as possible. No yelling, no accusations, just a simple, clear message. The note was a masterpiece of restraint. It said, "Hi. This is a private drive and is not a parking area. Please do not block the gate, as it is a safety hazard for emergency vehicles and a property access point. Thank you for your understanding." I even put a little smiley face at the bottom. I figured if I was nice, they would be nice. I walked over and tucked the note neatly under the windshield wiper, careful not to even touch the car itself. I wanted to show them I was a good neighbor, not some crazy rancher who didn't want anyone near his property. I was being the bigger person. I went about my day, and later that afternoon, I saw that the minivan was gone. A small part of me felt a rush of relief. My note worked. Reason had prevailed. Then, as I walked down to the mailbox, I saw it. Lying on the gravel right where the minivan had been parked was my note, but it wasn't neat anymore. It was crumpled up into a tight little ball, a symbol of utter disrespect. They hadn't just read it and left. They had read it, dismissed it, and thrown it on the ground right in front of my gate. All the patience I had held onto evaporated in that instant. It wasn't about a safety hazard or a private drive anymore. It was personal. They had seen my plea for common courtesy and literally tossed it aside. I stood there, staring at the little ball of paper, and I knew that a polite note was never going to solve this. It was time for a new approach, because I had just learned that these people didn't speak the language of reason. The next time it happened, I was ready. I walked down the driveway and calmly spoke to the driver. Her response was a shrug and "It's just a few minutes. What's the big deal?" I had been waiting in my truck for 10 minutes, watching her talk on her phone with a tiny dog perched on her lap. My polite note had been thrown on the ground, so I knew that this time I had to try a different approach. I was going to look her in the eye and explain the situation like two rational adults. I got out of my truck, my hands in my pockets to keep from clenching my fists. I walked up to her window, which was thankfully rolled down just a bit, and I forced a polite smile. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I'm the property owner here. This is a private drive, and you're blocking my gate." She took a long, slow drag from her vape pen and then looked at me, her face completely blank. "Yeah, I know," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I'm just waiting for Karen. We're riding together." My calm exterior was starting to crack. "I understand, but you can't park here. It's an access point. My signs say no trespassing for a reason." That's when she gave me the shrug. The most infuriating, nonchalant shrug I had ever seen. "It's just a few minutes. What's the big deal?" Her voice held the kind of casual disregard you use when someone asks you to hold their soda. It was a complete dismissal of my property, my privacy, and my safety concerns. I could feel the blood rush to my face. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. It wasn't an honest mistake. It wasn't even malicious. It was worse. It was pure, unadulterated apathy. She didn't care. It didn't matter what I said, what signs I had, or what logic I used. I was nothing more than an obstacle in her day, a brief, minor inconvenience. I just stood there for a moment, unable to form a response, and watched as she turned her attention back to her phone. I walked back to my truck, defeated. That was the last time I would ever try to reason with them. I realized then that my words didn't matter. It was time to find a solution that did. The cycle continued, and my patience was wearing thin. I went from polite notes to angry gestures. My sanity felt like it was hanging by a thread, and I knew I had to do something more than just complain. After the failed attempt at a face-to-face conversation, a new car would pull up, and I would feel a fresh wave of helpless fury. I started honking with a vengeance. I'd flash my headlights, yell out my window, and wave my arms like a maniac, but it was all useless. They would just stare back at me with a blank expression, as if they were looking at some bizarre, noisy animal at the zoo. I couldn't go to town without a sense of dread. Every time I drove back down my road, my eyes would instinctively dart toward my gate, bracing myself for the sight of yet another foreign vehicle parked on my property. My peaceful life on the ranch was being replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety. This wasn't just a parking problem anymore. It was an invasion. They were taking my peace of mind, one 5-minute intrusion at a time, and I was losing my mind. The frustration became a physical weight. My jaw would clench, my hands would grip the steering wheel, and I would feel a burning anger that felt disproportionate to the situation, but it was all I had left. The polite notes had been crumpled up and thrown on the ground. My calm conversation had been met with an arrogant shrug. The aggressive honking and gestures were just shrugged off as the ravings of a crazy person. I was trying to fight a war on their terms using reason and public shaming, and they were just laughing at me. One evening, I watched a car pull away from the gate. Instead of feeling relief, I felt empty. I had tried everything I could think of, and nothing worked. That was the moment it hit me. I had to stop playing by their rules. They didn't care about my notes, my pleas, or my angry gestures. They cared about one thing: their own convenience. If I was going to stop them, I had to make parking there a lot less convenient. I had to create a solution that didn't rely on their goodwill or their common sense, because they had neither. The time for reason was over. It was time for a trap. I was walking the property line with my dog, kicking at the muddy soil near the gate. I noticed a low spot that was a little softer than the rest. The idea hit me like a ton of bricks. A trap that wasn't malicious, just inconvenient. I had just finished mowing the back pasture, still fuming from the last encounter with one of Karen's friends. My dog, a scruffy terrier mix, trotted along beside me, his nose to the ground. My mind was still racing, trying to come up with a solution that didn't involve a confrontational argument I knew I would lose. I kicked at a lump of dirt near the fence line, and my boot sank in a couple of inches. It was a section of ground where water naturally pooled after a rain, creating a perpetually soft, almost bog-like area. My first thought was just to put a fence around it, but that felt like admitting defeat. It wouldn't solve the core problem of them treating my property like a public parking lot. But as I stared at the muddy boot print, the idea came to me. It was so simple, so perfect, and so utterly passive-aggressive that it felt like an act of genius. I wouldn't build a wall or a barrier. I would build a parking spot. I would take this naturally soft area, make it look perfectly appealing, and then let them park there. It wouldn't cause any real damage to their cars, just enough to make them think twice. The goal wasn't to hurt them. It was to embarrass them and make the act of parking there so incredibly inconvenient that they would never, ever do it again. I imagined their car tires spinning, sinking slowly into the mud, and the look on their faces as they realized they were stuck. The beauty of it was that it was a trap of their own making. They were choosing to park there, and I wasn't doing a single thing to them. I was simply creating the conditions for their poor judgment to backfire in spectacular fashion. My frustration from the past weeks drained away, replaced by a cold, calculated excitement. This wasn't about yelling or arguing. This was about turning their arrogance against them. I had the perfect place and the perfect plan. All I had to do now was get to work. I spent the next day drawing out a simple blueprint. It was less of a blueprint and more of a crude doodle on a napkin, but the plan was solid. The goal was to make a seemingly perfect parking spot that was actually a soft, gooey mess underneath. My ranch is full of projects, so I had no shortage of materials. I knew I needed to create an area that looked firm and inviting from a distance but would give way under the weight of a car. I drew a circle on the napkin, which represented the intended parking spot, and then sketched out the layers underneath. My plan was a simple one, based on the boggy spot I had already found. I would dig out a shallow depression and line it with a large plastic tarp. This would prevent any water from draining away. Then, I would backfill the area with the soft, silty topsoil that was so abundant on my property. The final and most crucial step was to cover the top of the pit with a thin, inviting layer of dry dirt and gravel. I would rake it smooth, making it look like a newly cleared, level spot that was just begging for a car to park on it. The beauty of the plan was its plausible deniability. I wasn't putting up a fence, or a spike strip, or a sign that said, "Go away." I was simply creating a very, very inconvenient piece of ground. If they chose to park there, that was their business, and I wasn't responsible for their poor judgment. In my mind, this was the perfect revenge. It was a silent, unassuming trap that relied entirely on their own arrogance. They wanted to use my land, so I was going to let them, in a way they would never forget. The frustration I had felt for weeks was now replaced with a quiet, methodical resolve. The plan was solid. All that was left to do was build it. My shopping list was simple: a few bags of topsoil, a cheap tarp, and a bag of gravel. The rest of the materials I found around the ranch. It felt a little bit like a mission. I didn't want to make a special trip just for this, so I added the items to my list for the next time I went to town. I had to time it just right, when I was already running other errands, so it wouldn't look suspicious. To a regular person, I was just a guy buying some landscaping supplies. To me, I was gathering the tools of justice. I walked the aisles of the local hardware store, a quiet sense of satisfaction growing inside me. I picked up the biggest, cheapest tarp they had. It was a dark blue color that would be easy to hide. Then I grabbed a couple of bags of topsoil. I wanted it to be as loose and unstable as possible, so the cheaper, sandier stuff was perfect. I even picked up a small bag of gravel to use as a cover. Each item I put in my cart felt like a strategic victory. My revenge was going to be built on a foundation of gardening supplies, and that thought made me smile. Back at the ranch, I went to work gathering the final materials I would need. I grabbed my shovel and my old, rusty wheelbarrow. I wheeled it over to the compost pile where I had some extra finely sifted topsoil from an old project. It was the perfect texture, light, fluffy, and completely useless for holding a car. I dug it out and loaded it into the wheelbarrow, a sense of purpose guiding every scoop. This wasn't just dirt, it was the foundation of the trap. I pushed the wheelbarrow down to the gate and hid all the supplies behind a large patch of bushes. My plan was set. All the pieces were in place. All that was left to do was build the trap itself. I got to work digging a shallow pit next to the gate. I laid the tarp down, filled it with a mixture of soft soil and a little water, and covered it with a thin layer of gravel and dry dirt to make it look solid. The area right in front of the gate was a high-traffic zone for Karen's friends, and it was the perfect place to build my masterpiece. I picked a spot where they tended to park, grabbed my shovel, and got to work. The soil here was already loose, so it wasn't a difficult dig. It didn't need to be deep, just a foot or so, enough to hold a good amount of mushy dirt. Once the pit was dug, I carefully laid out the big blue tarp, pressing it into the bottom and sides to create a watertight lining. It felt like I was building a tiny swimming pool for my revenge. Then came the messy part. I used the wheelbarrow to dump load after load of the light, sandy topsoil I had gathered. I poured some water over it, mixing it with the shovel until it was a thick, gooey paste. It was the perfect consistency for getting a car stuck. Now for the final, and most crucial, step, the deception. I scattered a thin layer of the gravel over the top, then added the dry, loose dirt from the bags I'd bought at the store. I used a rake to carefully smooth out the top layer, creating a surface that looked pristine and firm. It looked like a freshly graded parking spot, a smooth, inviting patch of ground right next to the gravel road. There was no sign of the muddy pit underneath, no hint of the tarp or the wet soil. I took a step back and admired my handiwork. It was perfect. It was a Trojan horse of a parking spot. A perfect piece of ground that was secretly a trap. The only thing left to do now was wait for them to take the bait. The trap was set. From the outside, it looked like the perfect place to park. A slightly raised, flat, and inviting spot right next to the gate. I was ready for them. I took one last walk around the area, admiring my work. The top layer of gravel and dry dirt was perfectly smooth, and I had even scattered a few loose leaves on top to make it look like a natural part of the landscape. It wasn't a hole or a ditch. It was just a patch of ground that looked better than the rest. The kind of spot that a person would instinctively choose if they were looking for a clean, stable place to stop. It was a perfect decoy. The beauty of the plan was that it was a trap of pure convenience. They wanted an easy place to park, and I had given them one. They wouldn't see any obvious signs of a problem. They would just pull in, get out of their car, and only when they returned would they discover that their tires were slowly sinking into a muddy, gooey mess. The thought of that delayed realization, that moment of pure, unadulterated shock, filled me with a quiet, calm satisfaction that was better than any angry outburst. I had found the perfect way to fight back without saying a single word. My days of frustration were over. My sanity was no longer hanging by a thread. I had regained control of the situation, not by yelling or arguing, but by turning their own arrogance against them. I went about my chores on the ranch, but with a new sense of purpose. Every time I heard a car coming down the road, my heart would beat a little faster. It was a waiting game, but this time, I was the one holding all the cards. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for the first person to take the bait. I knew it was only a matter of time. It was a waiting game. Every time a car drove up, my heart would pound. I couldn't wait for the moment of truth. My days were no longer spent in a state of quiet frustration. They were filled with anticipation. I found myself listening for the distinct sound of a car on the gravel road, my eyes constantly darting toward the ranch gate. The trap was ready, a perfectly unassuming patch of ground, waiting patiently for its first victim. I had a few near misses. One afternoon, a gray sedan slowed down right in front of the gate. The driver leaned forward, looked at the spot, and for a solid 15 seconds, I thought she was going to go for it. My heart was pounding in my chest. But then, she just sped off, and I was left with a mix of disappointment and a renewed sense of purpose. The perfect ambush required patience. I was confident in my work. I just had to wait for the right person to come along. My mind would replay the scene over and over. I pictured the moment the car would turn in, the tires biting into the top layer of dry dirt. I imagined the slight shudder as the wheels sank into the gooey, muddy pit underneath. I could almost hear the driver's gasp of confusion, the spin of the tires as they tried to get traction. I wasn't a bad person. I just wanted my property respected. This wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching a lesson in the only way they seemed to understand. And then, one morning, I heard it. A car was coming down the road, and this time, it was going slowly, too slowly. I watched from my kitchen window as a sleek black SUV pulled up to my gate. The driver, a woman with a phone pressed to her ear, gave the spot a quick glance, smiled, and turned her wheel. My heart jumped into my throat. The moment of truth had finally arrived. She was going to do it. And then it happened. An older, shiny sedan pulled up, and the driver saw the new parking spot. They backed right in, and the moment their tires hit the soft soil, the car sank. The driver's confused expression was priceless. I was watching from the window, and I held my breath as the car came to a stop. The driver, a woman with a perfectly coiffed haircut, leaned over and glanced at the ground, then turned back to her phone. For a second, nothing happened. It looked like a normal park job. But then, as she tried to adjust the wheel, the front tire gave a soft, almost inaudible squish. Her foot must have hit the gas, because the tire just spun. A thin spray of mud shot out from under the wheel. Her head snapped up from her phone. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. She put the car in reverse, gave it a little gas, and nothing happened. The wheels just spun deeper. She put it in drive. The same result. That's when the look of confusion on her face turned into a look of panic. She was stuck, and she had no idea why. I stayed absolutely still, a silent observer to her mounting frustration. She got out of the car, slammed the door, and stared at her sinking tire. The pristine shoes she was wearing were now resting in a puddle of muddy water. She took a step back, looking around as if the ground had just betrayed her. It had. The mud had completely swallowed her tire. She was trapped, and there wasn't a thing she could do about it. The best part? She had no one to blame but herself. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The perfect, silent revenge. She was on my property. She chose to park in a spot I made, and now she was paying for it. She reached for her phone, and I knew exactly who she was going to call. The queen of the cul-de-sac herself, HOA Karen. The show was just getting started. The driver's attempts to get out were futile. The tires just spun, sinking deeper into the gooey mess. They were well and truly stuck. After her initial moment of panic, she got back in her car, determined to free it. I could hear the engine revving from my window, a frantic, desperate sound. She floored the gas, but all that accomplished was to dig her tires in further, splattering thick brown mud all over the side of her perfectly white SUV. The car was now listing to one side, completely motionless. She tried putting it in reverse, then drive again, rocking the car back and forth, but the result was the same. The wheels just spun on the soupy soil, making a sound like a wet slap against the ground. The car was well and truly defeated. I had been worried my trap wasn't deep enough, but the moment I saw her car tilt slightly and the tires sink out of sight, I knew I had done a good job. She finally gave up, turning the engine off with a frustrated sigh I could almost hear from where I was watching. She got out of the car again, slamming the door this time, and stood there for a long moment, staring at the mud on her pristine tire. She looked around, as if searching for a hidden camera or some other sign of what had happened, but she didn't see anything. The spot looked so innocent, so harmless. My revenge was perfect because it didn't look like revenge at all. It looked like an accident of her own making. The final act of her defeated acceptance was pulling her phone from her purse. She was going to call for help, and I had a pretty good idea who was at the top of her list. Not long after, another friend of Karen's pulled up. They honked at the first car and then, completely unaware, decided to park in the exact same spot. They, too, sank. I was still watching from the window and I couldn't believe my luck. A small blue car, a convertible no less, pulled down the road and stopped next to the stuck SUV. The driver, a woman with a large pair of sunglasses, honked a few times, a little impatient. "What's the holdup?" "Kind of honk." She got out of her car, walked up to the first driver, and the two of them started talking. From my vantage point, I could see the first woman gesturing frantically at the mud-caked tire. She was trying to explain what had happened, that the ground was soft, that she was completely stuck. The woman in the sunglasses just shook her head, as if she didn't believe a word of it. She walked back to her car, opened the door, and with an air of complete confidence, waved her hand at the other woman, as if to say, "I've got this." My heart jumped into my throat, half in disbelief and half in pure, unadulterated glee. She was actually going to do it. She was going to park in the exact same spot. She backed her small convertible right up to the gate, her tires coming to a stop just inches from where the other car was stuck. For a split second I thought she had figured it out, but then she put the car in park and stepped out, only to hear the familiar, sickening squish as her wheels sank into the ground. Her face, framed by the oversized sunglasses, was a masterpiece of dawning horror. She had a look of complete shock, as if the ground had just reached up and betrayed her. She stood there, frozen, staring at her now muddy tires, and I had to put a hand over my mouth to keep from laughing out loud. Now there were two of them, 2 cars and 2 friends, completely trapped by a few bags of soil and a single tarp. This wasn't just a win, it was a double victory. And I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen herself showed up to see what all the commotion was about. Karen herself arrived, having been called by her 2 now-stranded friends. She pulled up and stomped out of her car, her face a mask of furious indignation. She was not happy. The screech of her tires on the gravel was a clear sign of her mood. Her car stopped with a jolt, and she practically leaped out, her body language radiating pure fury. She was dressed in an immaculate jogging suit, and her hair was in a perfect coiffed bob that seemed entirely out of place in the chaotic scene she was now facing. She looked at the 2 cars, one white, one blue, both defeated, both tilted at an awkward angle, their wheels swallowed by the mud. She looked at her 2 friends, who were standing there covered in splatters of mud, looking utterly miserable. Her gaze then snapped back to the mess itself. It was a magnificent sight. My little parking spot had become a 2-car trap, a monument to their arrogance. It was so much better than I could have ever planned. I had been hoping for 1 victim, but I got 2, and now the queen bee herself was here to witness the full muddy glory of her friend's mistake. Karen walked over to the edge of the mud pit, her hands on her hips. She looked at the perfectly smooth surface of the dry dirt, and then at the muddy, sunken tires. She couldn't process what had happened. She just stood there for a moment, shaking her head in disbelief. This was a problem she couldn't solve with a passive-aggressive note or a stern look. This was a physical mess, a very public embarrassment, and it was happening right next to my ranch gate. She finally turned to her friends and started yelling, her voice echoing across the quiet pasture. "What did you do?" she shrieked. "How did you manage to get stuck in a puddle?" She wasn't asking for an explanation. She was looking for someone to blame, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that she was about to turn and blame me. "What did you do?" she shrieked, pointing at the 2 mud-caked cars. She accused me of sabotage and demanded I fix it immediately. I was in my garage, working on an old tractor, when I heard her voice. It was a high-pitched, panicked yell that cut through the quiet afternoon air. I wiped my hands on an old rag, took a deep breath, and walked down to the gate. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to face her head on. She stood there, her hands on her hips, her eyes narrowed in a fury that seemed to shake her whole body. She wasn't just mad, she was personally offended that her friends had been inconvenienced. "You," she spat. Her finger now pointed directly at me. "You did this. You set a trap for them." Her friends, still standing there, looked on with a mixture of embarrassment and defeat. "This is private property," I said calmly, my voice low. "And the ground here is a bit soft. It's not my fault they chose to park there." My calm demeanor seemed to infuriate her more than any angry outburst would have. "You can't do that," she yelled. "This is a public road. You can't just make a trap on the side of it. This isn't a public road," I said, pointing to the no trespassing sign she had obviously ignored. "This is a private drive. My property line starts right there." I stepped forward and drew a line in the dirt with the toe of my boot. They chose to park on my property, and they chose to park on a soft patch of ground. I'm not responsible for their poor judgment. My words were simple, but they were facts. There was no arguing with them. Her face was turning a shade of purple, and she was fuming. She had come to the gate expecting a groveling apology, but all she got was a calm, reasoned explanation she couldn't argue with. The accusation had been her first shot, and it had completely backfired. She had no idea what to say next. I walked calmly to the gate and explained that the ground near the gate was always a bit soft, and that it wasn't a designated parking spot. "You parked on my property," I said, "and the ground couldn't hold your car." Karen's mouth was still open, her face a bright red, but she was speechless. She had expected me to yell back, to defend myself, but all I was doing was stating the facts. I gestured toward the fence line. My property starts right here. These are private grounds. There are signs up that clearly say, "No trespassing." Her friends, still standing there, looked from me to Karen, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and confusion. Karen finally managed to find her voice again, a little less confident this time. But it looks like a parking spot. It's flat. You can't just put a bog in a parking area. I just looked at her, and with a simple gesture, I gestured toward the dirt, the grass, and the mud. "This is a ranch," I said simply. "This isn't a suburban parking lot. The ground is what the ground island you parked a car in the dirt. It sank. It's a simple cause and effect." I made my words as straightforward as I could, stripping away all the drama she was trying to create. It was a cold, hard dose of reality, and she wasn't prepared for it. She wanted a villain, but all she got was a man stating the truth. My defense wasn't an argument. It was an explanation. It was a quiet, firm line drawn in the sand. I hadn't broken any laws, I hadn't destroyed any property, and I was not going to pay for her friend's bad judgment. I had a feeling this conversation was going nowhere, and I just stood there, waiting. I had said all I needed to say. After a brief argument, the friends called a tow truck. The narrator watches with a sense of quiet satisfaction as the tow truck driver, with a look of amusement, pulls both cars out of the mud. Karen's face was a mixture of outrage and disbelief as her friends pulled out their phones. It was clear that my simple, factual defense had taken the wind out of her sails. There was nothing more to say. They couldn't argue with the fact that they were stuck, so they called for help. About 30 minutes later, a large tow truck rumbled down the gravel road. The driver, a big man with a thick beard and a baseball cap, got out and took one look at the scene. He saw the two cars, the two frustrated friends, and a fuming Karen. Then he looked at me, standing calmly by my gate. I gave him a small wave, and he just shook his head, a slight smile on his face. He clearly understood what had happened, without a single word being said. He was a professional, and he'd seen it all. He went to work, winching the first car out of the pit. The sound of the winch cable pulling taut was a beautiful sound to my ears. There was a loud, sucking plop as the tires were finally released from my muddy trap. He pulled the SUV out, and the driver quickly got in and drove away without a single word of thanks. He then hooked up the convertible, and with the same patient effort, he pulled it out as well. The second driver drove off in a similar hurry, leaving only a huge mess and a very angry Karen behind. The tow truck driver gave me a quick nod as he drove away, as if to say, "Well played." I just watched the whole spectacle unfold, and a quiet sense of triumph settled over me. They were gone, the cars were free, and the problem was, for now, solved. The parking problem stopped. It was a silent victory. They never parked there again. For the first few days, I found myself instinctively looking out the window every time I heard a car coming down the road. But each time, the car would slow down, see the messy patch of ground, and then speed right past my gate. The message had been received loud and clear. My peaceful life on the ranch was slowly returning. The quiet was the best part. I no longer felt that familiar dread every time I drove to my gate. The absence of their cars was a constant, welcome presence. It was the perfect revenge. I didn't have to get into a shouting match or call the cops. The trap did all the work for me. It was a simple, elegant solution to a very frustrating problem. My property had been disrespected, and now that disrespect had come back to bite them, literally, in the form of a gooey, muddy mess. I would see them from time to time, the white SUV and the blue convertible driving down the road, always at a slightly faster speed when they approached my gate. They would give the spot a wide berth, as if it were a landmine. I would just smile to myself. The silent victory was better than any verbal confrontation. It showed that my boundaries had been set, and I was going to defend them in a way they would not forget. The friends had clearly learned their lesson, but I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. Karen, the queen of the cul-de-sac, was not one to let a defeat go unanswered. I was sure she was already plotting her next move. The parking war was over, but the HOA war was about to begin. A few days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA, demanding I fill in the pothole I had created. I wasn't even surprised. After the spectacle at the gate, I knew Karen wasn't going to let it go. She was an official person, a rule follower, and my simple, elegant solution didn't fit into her neat little world. A certified letter was her way of getting an official-sounding authority to do her dirty work. I signed for it with a heavy sigh, took it inside, and tore it open. The language was exactly what I expected. Dry, bureaucratic, and completely ridiculous. It cited some vague community guidelines about maintaining the common area and said that I had created a nuisance that needed to be remedied. But what really got me was the part where it referred to my trap as a pothole. It was so clearly Karen's phrasing, a petty little jab meant to imply that what I had done was an act of neglect. Not a deliberate, clever plan. It made me laugh out loud. She had tried to turn my revenge into a violation, but all she had done was show her hand. I wasn't worried. Not one bit. This wasn't a fight on the street. This was a fight on paper. And I knew I had the law on my side. I immediately went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the thick packet of HOA bylaws I was given when I bought the ranch. I had read them cover to cover, just in case of a situation like this. I knew exactly what was in there, and I was sure that there was nothing in the entire document that said a homeowner couldn't have a patch of soft ground on their property. This was her last desperate gasp for control, and I was going to shut her down. I had won the parking war, and now I was going to win the paper war. I was ready. I attended the next HOA meeting, where I calmly presented photos of the no parking and private drive signs. I explained that I was not responsible for drivers choosing to park in a soft, non-designated area. The meeting was being held in a tiny community room that smelled like old coffee. There were a few bored-looking board members and a very tense-looking Karen. She was perched on the edge of her seat, clutching a stack of papers, her eyes narrowed in a stare of pure malice. She was ready for a fight, and I was going to give her a show. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the front of the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get emotional. I just held up a large printout of the photograph I had taken weeks ago, the one with the no trespassing and private drive signs right at my gate. I then showed them a close-up of the signs themselves. As you can see, I said, my voice as calm as a Sunday morning. My property is clearly marked. This is not a public parking area, and it is not a part of the common area. I then went on to explain, in plain, simple terms, exactly what had happened. I described the repeated instances of her friends blocking my gate and my failed attempts at a polite conversation. I even mentioned the crumpled note. I concluded by stating that I was not responsible for the poor judgment of a car choosing to park in a soft patch of ground that was clearly a non-designated parking area. Karen stood up, sputtering, but he created a hazard, a trap. She held up her papers, but the board members just looked at her, then back at my photos. The truth was on my side, and it was so simple, it was undeniable. She had no winning argument, and she knew it. I cited the bylaws, which clearly stated that residents were not to block driveways. I pointed out that it was, in fact, HOA Karen's friends who were in violation. Karen was still sputtering about me creating a nuisance, her face a bright red. The board members were looking at her with a mix of impatience and embarrassment. She was making a scene, and it was clear she was just making things up as she went along. I held up my copy of the HOA bylaws, a thick, spiral-bound book. I had it open to the exact page I needed, Section 4, Subsection C. I said calmly, reading the words aloud. Residents and their guests shall not impede access to a private driveway or property gate. All vehicles must be parked in a designated parking area or on the public street, leaving clear access for all residents and emergency vehicles. I looked up from the page and let the silence hang in the air for a moment. My ranch gate is a property gate, and my driveway is a private driveway. My signs, as I have shown, clearly mark this. Her friends, by parking there, were in direct violation of this bylaw. Karen's mouth fell open. She had no response. Her entire argument had been based on the idea that I had done something wrong, and I had just used her own rules to prove that she was the one who was in violation. The board members, who had been looking bored just a few minutes ago, now looked at me with a new sense of respect. They looked at the bylaws, then at Karen, and a silent understanding passed between them. The meeting was over, and the outcome was clear. I had won the paper war. I hadn't just gotten out of a fine. I had proven that Karen's friends were the ones who were in the wrong all along. I stood up, thanked the board, and walked out. I had not only defended my property, but I had used their own rule book to defeat them. There was nothing more to be said. The HOA meeting ended in a silent stalemate. They dropped the issue. I got to keep my gate and my sanity. After my final calm statement, the board members looked at each other, then at Karen, who was now sitting with her arms crossed, glaring at me. It was clear from their expressions that the case was closed. They had no interest in arguing against their own bylaws, and they certainly had no desire to get involved in what was clearly a petty neighborhood dispute. I wasn't fined. I wasn't ordered to do anything. I just walked out of that little room with my head held high, knowing I had won on all fronts. The revenge felt even sweeter because it was a double victory. First, I had won the physical battle, using a clever, non-destructive trap to teach her friends a lesson in manners. They hadn't parked there since, and I was sure they never would again. The fear of that muddy patch of ground was more effective than any sign or lecture. And second, I had won the legal battle. Karen had tried to use the system against me, and I had used that very same system to not only defend myself, but to turn the tables on her and prove that she and her friends were the ones in the wrong. She had come prepared for a war, and I had simply shown up with the rule book. When I got home, I stood by my ranch gate, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of complete peace. The grass was green, the road was clear, and my pothole was just a spot of dry dirt. This whole ordeal had been a nuisance, but it had also been a valuable lesson. It was a reminder that some people will only respect your boundaries when you physically and legally enforce them. It was a simple, unspoken victory, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. My ranch was my sanctuary again, and I had a feeling it would stay that way for a very, very long time. The gate remains, and the parking spot has since dried up, but no one has ever tried to park there again. I occasionally see Karen and her friends drive by, but they always give the ranch gate a wide berth. The quiet on the ranch is back, and I plan on keeping it that way. The whole ordeal feels like it happened a lifetime ago. The mud pit I created has long since dried up, and the ground has settled back into a perfectly unassuming patch of dirt. To a stranger, it looks like nothing more than a part of the field. To me, it's a monument to a small, private victory. The ranch gate stands tall and proud, just as it should, and no one dares to park in front of it anymore. My little patch of peace and quiet is mine again. I still see her, of course. Not often, but every once in a while, I'll spot Karen or one of her friends driving down the road. They'll slow down a bit as they approach my property, and for a second, I'll feel that familiar tension. But then, they'll see the clear road and the innocent-looking patch of dirt, and they'll speed up, giving my gate a wide, respectful berth. It's an unspoken agreement. They learn their lesson. The moral of the story isn't about revenge. It's about a man's right to his property and his peace of mind. I could have gotten angry. I could have yelled or put up a giant ugly sign. But I chose a different path. I chose to use my head. I created a solution that was so simple, so perfect, and so passive-aggressive that it completely defeated them without me having to say a single word. My ranch is my home, and now, more than ever, I know that my boundaries are respected. The quiet on the ranch is back, and that, more than anything, is the perfect ending to this story.